Welcome everyone to our continued study in the book of James, the study that I've entitled The Immediate Gospel. And the idea being that James knew who Jesus was intimately, with him having been his brother. He knew what Jesus was looking for in his followers. He knew the behaviors that Jesus had exemplified in his own life. And as such, James was expecting, and he wanted the followers of Jesus to expect as well, that following Jesus in their life would have an immediate impact. And it would have an immediate impact in their day-to-day routines and the things that they thought were normal becoming abnormal. We saw a beautiful example of that last week, or the last time we studied together, when we looked at the end of chapter 2, when James challenges them of how they would normally accept rich and wealthy guests as compared to outsiders and outcasts. And James simply takes what we think is cultural norm, and that is the promoting of visiting preachers and politicians and traveling sports people and figures and movie stars and those sorts of things. And James takes that idea and turns it on its head and says that by promoting those folks, we're actually doing harm to the body of Christ, and we're going against the functionality of how Jesus lived his life and the ministry that he had on this earth. And so that is an immediate gospel. That's a change. Our culture says that we need to find someone that is popular, someone that is successful, and then we need to figure out how to bring them into Christianity and utilize their skills and their abilities. James, on the other hand, says if you get caught up in that, you've polluted who Jesus is and his purpose. So today we're going to jump in and we're going to do chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. And it's probably one of the better known passages in James. Last week, I believe we looked at the one where it says, show me your works and I'll show you my faith. Show me your faith and I'll show you my works. That's probably one of the best known passages in James. And this one is very close behind it, when he talks about our tongues and taming our tongues, or the inability we have to tame our tongues. And so we're going to start in chapter 3, and we're going to start, we're just going to read verses 1 through 12. I want to read the whole context there for you all. Hey, just a reminder, get on YouVersion, turn on the speaking version, however they call that, where it is dictated to you, 16 minutes. And the NIV version, and you have heard the entire book of James. 16 minutes. All right, so check that out. Take the time to do that and get James's overall desire that he is trying to get to the church and understand where he is headed. Chapter 3 and verse 1. Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings, who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Let's think about a couple of things first of all. First of all, we are logical beings. You and I are logical beings. We see and understand sums, whether it's numbers, or whether it's just the realities of behavior. We understand logical things. Now, you may think you're more logical than others, but everyone to some degree is a logical being. We understand cause and effect. That if I were to push this podium, ultimately it would reach its tipping point and it would fall over. We understand that if you hold a piece of paper up in the air and drop it, ultimately it will hit the ground. We understand that. We're logical. Logic helps us understand that. We also understand possibilities. That if there are a certain number of people in the room, there's a certain possibility for a certain number of opinions. Or that if you throw a ball to a friend, they may catch it, they may drop it. Depending on where you throw it, may have an impact on whether or not they catch it or drop it. So we understand and we are logical beings. But that's not all we are. We are also emotional beings. We respond to visual stimuli. We see something and it excites us or it gains our interest, and the next thing you know, we're staring, we're looking, we're checking. What is that? Is that really what I think it is? Maybe it's a sunset. Maybe it's a sports play. Maybe it's seeing somebody that you halfway recognize and you aren't sure. Maybe it's a celebrity like I mentioned earlier. You're walking through a public place or something and you see someone and you kind of do a half check to make sure, is that really who I thought it was? So we are emotional creatures. We respond to what we see visually. It's not just logic, but we respond visually with our emotions. We also respond to what we hear. Plants, it has been proven, respond to what they quote unquote hear, the sound vibrations that are in the room. And so we respond. You hear someone crying, maybe your anxiety goes up. Maybe you hear someone yelling and you feel your tension in your body begin to rise. Or maybe you hear someone cheering and you feel your adrenaline begin to pump. Maybe you're an athlete and you're playing and the ball, I'm going to use soccer as an example because I've watched a little bit of soccer lately with one of my kids, and you see the ball move into the clear and the player is chasing it, and the anticipation of the crowd brings this roar that the players can hear, and their excitement and their adrenaline goes up in the moment as they respond to that emotional stimuli. We also respond to a feeling of a moment, and I wanted to put this in here to really drive this point home. You walk into a place, maybe it's very quiet. And you begin to look around and question. Maybe you're hesitant. Maybe you're the loud and boisterous type, and for a moment you get quiet. Or maybe you get louder because the quietness unnerves you. Or maybe you're the quiet person who doesn't even want to be in a room where it's too quiet, or whatever the situation may be. We respond emotionally to places, events, and things that we see and things that we hear. Now, think about what I've said there. We are rational, we're logical, we are also emotional. And while these two realities are not necessarily opposed to each other, they can certainly work against each other at any given moment. Think going back to soccer. The player breaks into the open. The other player has their foot next to the ball. They've done this play hundreds, thousands of times. They hear the roar of the crowd, and their emotion overcomes the logic, and when they go to kick, a simple kick that they have done multiple times before shanks off to the right. Maybe you've seen that in golf. How as the tension builds in a moment, someone can all of a sudden hit a very errant shot. I enjoy watching disc golf, and it's just like regular golf in the sense that there are moments when you can feel the pressure rising, and you see someone let loose of that frisbee, a throw that they've done hundreds, even times just that week alone, and it goes completely awry. So how do we rectify these things? Because at some moments they seem to work against each other. At some moments they actually work with each other. And sometimes the question is, what is going to take the lead, the logical or the emotional? Which do you need to take the lead? Well, think about this. How is that normally seen in our lives? Now let's move off the sports field for just a minute and think about our lives and how are we seen logically, emotionally, and how do we respond to the circumstances of our life? Normally, we see the way we respond, or the way we respond is understood by what we say, our tongues. And so we're going to look at that today and how we respond to the circumstances of our life and how our tongue defines not only who we are, but where we are headed. And that is such an important thing to understand. Not only does your tongue say who you are in that moment, but it also gives a great view as to where you are headed. And that can be a frightening thing, because James calls it later on, he says the tongue is literally the cesspool of hell. Now, why would he say that? Why would he say that my tongue, your tongue, is literally the cesspool of hell? Well, remember what it means to follow Jesus? To follow Jesus means we have to deny ourselves. And the very first thing the tongue wants to do is praise ourselves and deny others. So let's jump in and understand this here. The first thing he cautions them against, he says, first of all, you don't all need to be teachers. Two cautionary statements here when it comes to being a teacher. Don't be a teacher if you have to be seen and heard. And don't be a teacher if you have to always be right. And as someone who teaches, I don't make those statements lightly. They are revealing statements about myself, of how many times I want to be right. Or not only do I want to be right, I want everyone to know that I'm right. And that's probably more dangerous in the long run. So we need to know that there is a challenge of being a teacher of God's Word and a replicator, or someone who is teaching others of the ways of Jesus. But then James goes back and he really starts to hammer this thing home about the tongue. And so he gives us an idea of what the tongue is representative of. And he uses a couple of illustrations. And he uses an illustration of a horse. And if you think of a 1,200-pound creature that is literally being pulled and moved in every direction by a piece of metal that's about 4 inches long and maybe a ½ inch thick. And what James is saying is that piece of metal in that horse's mouth dictates where that horse goes and what that horse does. And then he says, imagine a ship, this great big huge ship, and it's driven by this small rudder, this small piece of wood that is in the water that determines which way that ship goes. And he pushes it even further. He says, you think that ship's being moved around by the wind. He's like, it's not. The tongue, if you will, the example being the tongue, that ship is really being moved and directed by that small rudder. He says, and just like those two small things make these great things happen, he says, so too is the danger of the tongue. And I want you to think about something here. What our tongue says is who we are. If our tongue is speaking cursings and jealousies and angers and condemnations, that is the person that we are. Interestingly enough, this is the same type of reasoning that Paul uses in Romans chapter 10 that we love to quote when it comes to understanding what it means to be a child of God and placing our faith in Jesus. Paul says this, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. And what Paul is literally saying is that your heart and your mouth are going to be moving in the same direction, and they are literally going to be speaking for each other. What your heart thinks, your mouth speaks. What your mouth speaks, your heart acts upon. Okay? And so what James is saying is this. You've got to understand that what you are saying really, really matters. Not only does it reveal who we are, but it says what we become. Now, I don't want us to get all caught up here, but listen to me, students. If you constantly say you're a failure, guess what? You'll be a failure. If you constantly say you can't get better, guess what? You won't get better. If you constantly say I'm just, then you will always be just. Now, as I caution you here, because doesn't mean you go around and make all these grand statements about yourself, but the reality of it is what we say about ourselves and what we say about others is the potential that they have and that we have. The world is literally on fire because we cannot stop firing back. I'm thinking more along the adult lines here, but when we have bad service, we blow it up on social media. When we believe something is wrong, we tell everybody on social media. When our neighbor is shooting off fireworks, we tell everybody on social media. Whether we did it in person or whether we did it on social media, the point is still the reality is that we can't stop ourselves. Look at what that looks like. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. That's verse 6, but listen to what verse 5 says. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. And then listen here. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. We need to be quiet. This does not mean we don't share our opinions. This does not mean we don't share our concerns. This does not mean we don't have conversations. However, this means that we understand the possible implications of everything that we share and everything that we say in the moments that we share them and say them, and the possible reparations down the road, the possibilities that we encounter down the road. And so I want to ask you the question, and we just jump off board here for just a minute. Are you setting the world on fire? Does your tone have anything? What about the inflection of your words? What about the words themselves? What about the words that they're responding to? And if everything is on fire, what's left? If we literally burn the world down around us, what do we have left? By the way, whose work is that? Whose work is it to be the destroyer? Now, this doesn't mean we bury our heads in the sands. It doesn't mean we don't have opinions, and it doesn't mean we don't share them. I've seen many of you former students that are doing that wonderfully. It's awesome to see. It just makes me excited to see the way you share. But be careful you don't burn the world down around yourself. How do we do that? Well, we start out by owning and claiming our personal responsibility. Look at verses 7 through 13. First of all, it says, all kinds of creatures, birds, animals, reptiles are being tamed, but the tongue cannot be tamed. It's full of deadly poison. The number one thing you need to understand, the number one thing that I need to understand, is that nobody has perfectly tamed their tongue, and everyone should stop and examine themselves on a regular basis. James is saying these things in light of who Jesus was, and he knew what it was like to see someone control their tongue, and he literally said, nobody else has done it. And he's implicating himself in that statement. How are some of the ways that we can control our tongue? Number one, hit delete. Number two, don't hit the like button. Don't hit the share button. Listen, students, listen to me. Instagram, I know it's a beautiful place. I know you have a great time there. You guys and girls, be careful that you're not feeding a world of fire in the things that you're liking and unliking. TikTok. TikTok can be hilarious. There are some funny things on there. There's some great instructional things on there. But be careful that you're not just shedding this fire, this consuming fire. There was a video that started going around last week. And it looks to be a young lady pulls up to a gas pump. And literally she cannot get her vehicle right and at the right spot to pump gas. And about 10 seconds into the video, I said, why am I watching this? And I don't always do this. Normally I laugh at that stuff. But I've been studying this passage, and I said to myself, why am I watching this? I'm only watching this to mock that lady. And if I hit the like button, that's like me saying, yeah, dummy, idiot. You guys and girls need to be careful. You need to understand that you literally might be pouring gasoline on the fire around you. Throw out the cliches. Quit saying them. That's more for adults than it is for kids. Adults, quit with the cliches. Words have meanings. And a cliche that's 50 years old probably doesn't mean the same thing today that it did then. Or if it does, the people that are hearing it may need to have it interpreted to them in today's terms so that they understand it correctly. Sarcasm. I've built a life enjoying it and participating in it, but it's really an enemy. It's really your enemy. What does it look like? Well, here's what he says. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Now, I want you to think about this. Who is he writing to here? He's writing to believers in Jesus. He says, out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. You cannot honor God and tear down people. That does not mean you can't critique people. It does not mean you cannot criticize people. There is a difference. The tone that you use, the words that you use, the inflections you use, the way you make that whole thing come together defines it. I can look at you right now and say, I think so-and-so is a bad quarterback. I think that so-and-so is a bad point guard in relation to the rest of their league or the rest of their people. However, if I say, man, he's a terrible quarterback, I tell you what, he can't even do this, he can't do that, he's got this awful, he doesn't, and I just go on and on. I literally am destroying a person made in God's image, and you can't do that. You can't do that and honor God because that person is made in God's image, and you literally are mocking God in your destruction of that person. If you think someone is an idiot and treat them as such, which I can be guilty of doing, then we are dishonoring God, period. Christians can be the world's worst at this. We think that our heaven insurance that we bought, that we're going to go to heaven when we die, and we got some morality clause in it, gives us the right to mock others. It does not. Listen to me, if you're an adult, stay away from Christian sarcasm. It's really mocking people made in the image of God, and it is not Christ-honoring, and it will lead you down a path of destruction. And I could start naming sites and places, but I don't even need to do that. Let God's Spirit tell you what it is. But ask yourself, is this for the destruction of others? You said, well, it's pointing out people's inconsistencies. You can point out people's inconsistencies without mocking them. You can point out people's inconsistencies without degrading the person that's made in the image of God. Praising and cursing can't coexist. So how do we rectify this? Number one, you be quiet a lot more. Number two, you praise a lot more. He said you're praising God and you're cursing others. That doesn't work. So how do we fix it? Well, the first thing you do is start with the one thing you can actually control, and that's being quiet more. And number two, how do you help your ratios? Start praising more. It doesn't mean you go around saying, oh, that's such a good person. No, you define what it is about them that's good. I admire that they are always on time. I admire that they care for others. I disagree with how they do that. I disagree with their processes. I disagree with this, but I admire this about them. Think about how much our world would look differently. Think about how you and your friends would react differently if you would do that, and how you would treat them differently. Ultimately, the way we speak of others reveals our true desires. And this is just kind of the hammer point here. You can't plant a grapevine and get figs. You know, figs come from trees, not from vines. And you can't go to a saltwater spring and get fresh water. So what we are saying about others really reveals what we want. It reveals we want goodness or we want death. It reveals we want life or we want destruction. Consider your tongue and how you're using it. I know it's tough to do, and it's personal to do, but it is what God has called us to do as we follow Him, and as James instructs us in following Jesus. Thank you. God bless you.